Welcome. I mentioned that I would do a short presentation as well in preparation for your work this week to be sharing next week. The program that I use, although there are others as well, is free and it's online and it's called Screencast-O-Matic. So if you Googled Screencast-O-Matic, you can record up to 15 minutes for free and do something like what I'm doing right now. It's very straightforward. So if you'd like to try that out for the first time, I strongly encourage it. Or you could go make a traditional PowerPoint and add audio to that, or record yourself in some other fashion. But I challenge you, if you've done PowerPoints or Prezis in the past, to try to step it up a notch. Add some sound, add a picture of yourself, things like that. I look forward to, regardless, seeing your presentations. So PowerPoint or Prezi or some type of screencast sharing, remember, with multiple outside resources, 3 or more resources beyond your text to be used as part of your presentation. So without further ado, I will take you to my presentation, which is one second, changing the screen here. There you go. Giftedness in early childhood. So this is a major passion area of mine. I mentioned a big part of my background is both gifted and special education, and now I work with a variety of schools focused just on gifted education and have had that be a primary focus of mine for quite a while now. So I'm excited to tell you a bit about what you would be looking for in early childhood. Last week we talked about twice exceptionalities, which is almost even trickier because then you're looking for traits that could indicate a possible disability along with traits that could identify a child as being gifted. I'll tell you a bit about how giftedness is traditionally defined. So giftedness is traditionally defined as an IQ of 130 or higher. There's different definitions, but that's often what we're looking for. 100 is an average IQ. 130 and higher is looking at the top 3% of the population. They're only looking at other kids that are the same age. So for instance, I would be looking at, let's say if I did these cognitive tests, these IQ tests, at 3 years old, 1 month. I would only be comparing that child that is 3 years old, 1 month to other children that are 3 years old, 1 month, and we're looking at that top 3% of the population. Sometimes the top 5% is looked at as well. So sometimes we're looking at a 125 or higher, but often a 130 or higher IQ, which if you're familiar with the bell curve, that would be 2 standard deviations above the mean. If you're looking for intellectual disability, or what years ago was called mental retardation, one of the primary markers there is 2 standard deviations or more below the mean, which is an IQ of 70 or higher. Some of those tests are looking at things like vocabulary, memory, problem-solving ability, the ability to kind of put things together in sequence and patterns. And these are tests that are given, the best tests are given one-on-one. It takes some time. It's given by a psychologist. So it's not a test that everyone does by any means, but it is one that is given sometimes when trying to determine what a child's needs are. So I do some testing with 3 to 6 year olds for a couple different schools as part of their gifted admissions, and really enjoy that and get to see these children and all of their amazing little abilities during this. This graphic at the bottom, that is another way to look at giftedness. This is from Joseph Renzulli. There's a few different psychologists. There's also a Robert Sternberg, but this is Joseph Renzulli that says, you know, if we're looking at giftedness, it's looking at 3 things. One is that above average ability. That's usually what we're talking about. Another piece that he looks at is creativity, and another piece is behavior, that task commitment behavior. So we do know that that's extremely important. And if any of you are familiar with Carol Dweck, they talk about growth mindset. It is that idea that we do know that we can have an impact on our learning, on our memory, on many, many things by staying focused on our growth and our learning process. So it's important to recognize the needs of these kids. It's also important to not go, oh, they're gifted, so this means X or this means Y. We want to recognize that everyone also has some opportunities for growth within themselves. Some of the traits, I'm going to just give you a couple common scenarios. One is Zeke. He was a little boy that I worked with a lot. I changed the name, of course. But he was very, very dominant personality, and he really struggled a lot in class. A lot of times kids, especially even if they're doing well later, a lot of times gifted children, when they're younger, they struggle. They struggle for a variety of reasons that we'll be sharing in a moment, but they might not be understood well by their peers. He was extremely dominant and preferred to talk to the adults around him. And when he knew what he wanted to do or what he wanted a piece of artwork to look like and it didn't work, he would become extremely frustrated and really act out aggressively. And the other kids, you know, in some ways the word peer doesn't even fit here, but the kids that were his age, he didn't know how to play with them, and he didn't have a lot in common with them. At the same time, of course, he was 5 years old. So, you know, 10-year-olds weren't necessarily interested in playing with him either at all times. So it became very challenging for him with peers. For typical development, we would see, you know, kids playing by themselves, and then what we call parallel play as they're getting a bit older. And by 5, they're going to be quite cooperative with their age mates or with their peers. That doesn't mean without a lot of, you know, conflict happening on and off. But he was very much so doing some more solitary things sometimes, and really struggled with that cooperative piece still. For a lot of children, by the time they're 5, if you ask, you know, who are you? Tell me about yourself. They'll say things like, I'm a girl, or I have long hair, or I play soccer, right? So it's social traits, things that they do together, or the ways that they look. Whereas kids, even when they're quite young, still might say, right, I'm shy, or I'm introverted, or I'm anxious. So they're using some more psychological terms that we wouldn't typically see from children until they're quite a bit older. These are obviously all patterns that are found. That doesn't mean that all gifted children are like this by any means. Some traits that you might notice. So I want you to think of kids or that you work with now or that you have in the past that might fit this. They might be extremely intense. I mean, you can just feel the intensity coming off of them. And very unique interests. So the one little boy that I worked with was fascinated by meteorology, and he really wanted to know everything about that. My son went through a train phase, and people would say, oh yeah, my kid likes trains too. Everyone goes through a train phase. But it was intense, and it was all that he talked about, read about, did for a couple of years or more. They might be extremely they're often extremely empathetic, meaning that they're when someone else is hurt or angry or things like that, they really, really feel for them. It can get difficult though. So that could be where they're crying or upset because someone else is upset. For instance, my son had a friend whose toy broke, and that little boy got over it very quickly, and my son was still talking about it days later because he was picturing what that would be like to have a toy break. So they can be extremely sensitive. That could be extremely sensitive to you offering help as well, right? They typically recognize that they're different from others, and often they're not going to like it, right? Sometimes girls even more than boys. There's a big pressure to want to fit in and to want to be like everyone else, and that may not be happening. Part of being ahead and getting bored easily might be that they are often a leader. That could also look like bossy or wanting to tell everyone what to do. So these are some challenges for them. Exceptionalities, part of what this class is all about, require us to make some modifications to the classroom environment to meet their needs. That could be regardless of if we're talking about disabilities or giftedness or twice exceptionalities. A really common thing for gifted children, more so than average children and adults, is what's called asynchronous development. And there's nothing wrong here. This is just common. I'm going to use my hands to demonstrate this. One moment here. So asynchronous development, if I was going to chart, picture this line as being average. And none of us, if I said, you know, where are you at with math, reading, social skills, art, and PE, for instance, or physical education, we're not going to go, oh, I'm dead average on everything, right? Sorry, trying to make my line look even here. It's not going to be a straight line. Maybe I go, oh, well, I'm up here, if this is above average and this is below average. I'm up here for reading. I'm about here for math, just below average. Social skills, maybe I'm way up here, for instance, and PE, oh gosh, I can't do anything in PE. And so it looks like this. It's not a straight average pattern. So all of us have some asynchrony, but the more and more gifted a person is, the more likely they are to have big asynchronies. So a child could be 5 years old, but they could be reading at a 5th grade level and comprehending, not just decoding, but comprehending at a 5th grade level. And maybe their social skills are down at about a 3.5-year-old level. And their math is average, and their art is maybe just a little above average. But then they have poor fine motor skills, and so they're about a year behind in fine motor skills. So the more gifted a person is, the more likely they are to have big asynchronies. And that's just a part of being gifted for many individuals. Okay, so that's a bit on asynchrony. So typical development for a child would be to have first word spoken prior to the age of 1. Pre-reading behaviors around 3 to 4. So that again is, holding the book correctly, recognizing, kind of going left to right, remembering some patterns, say of Dr. Seuss books and so on. I apologize for the clocks in the background, but doing some of those things, right? Maybe singing the ABCs and so on. And maybe remembering 2 or 3 things or being able to follow 2 steps by the age of 2. For gifted children, a lot of times this is happening much earlier. So early speaking ability, early vocabulary, not just big vocabulary, but early is very common. I can remember my son was very, very talkative, and he still is. But for instance, by the time he was 1, he was speaking very clearly. And so people would say to me, "How old is your baby?" And my son would say, "My name's Thomas, I'm 1 year old." And they're like, "Oh, that's cute. Is he 2? And I was like, "No, he's 1. But he just had that extremely extensive vocabulary, and it came early. For many, reading early, even without a teacher or a parent showing them a lot, happens often. It is, remember, there's lots of times when that may not happen if they have disabilities and such, but that is common. Okay, for students that are English language learners, that's going to look different, right? Because they might be behind in speaking and reading and so on because they're trying to learn the language still. So the things that you would look for a lot of times would be a student that is picking up the new language very quickly in spite, that are picking it up quickly or seem to be understanding you even though they don't have the language. It could be sophisticated or funny humor, exceptional creativity, being able to solve puzzles well, and things like that. I mentioned a lot of this already, but excellent memory, making diverse connections that you're just kind of amazed that they're remembering and connecting from maybe something you read in a different book or a different time. Physically, sometimes they are ahead as well. So my one cousin, Sonia, who was also identified gifted, was walking by 6 months old. And she stayed physically advanced always. Sometimes that stereotype of the awkward or physically unskilled gifted kiddo pops up as well. And especially for some kiddos, they might be, really into science, for instance, but then, just very uncoordinated. So know that for gifted development, a lot of times all the milestones, including physical development, may be earlier, but they might be viewed as less physically capable later. So we want to think about developmentally appropriate practice being redefined. That needs to be for their individual needs, both socially and cognitively. So a lot of schools say, oh, we're a social or we're a cognitive program. I would say, let's make sure that we've got both. Partner and collaborate with others. Use some resources. And I'm going to list some of those for you. We're talking about differentiating instruction already, but you can differentiate what they're learning about, also what they're producing. Educate yourself. Place them with similar peers for their instruction. So if there's kids that have similar interests or older kids at times as well. Celebrate that diversity. Let them test out and do independent projects so that they're not doing things they already know. And here are some resources. So there's a great new book, Teaching Gifted Children in Preschool and Primary Classes, and these web resources, NAGC and the Hoagie's Gifted. That's all. I want you to let me know if you have any questions, and you can see the resources. I look forward to talking to you soon.